Hi guys. Hi guys, here we are. We're going to start on chapter 7, which was the first chapter in the second grouping of the course. We're talking about persuading consumers, and we're going to start out talking about communication and different methods that people use when they send their advertising messages out. So here we go. This is a little bit of a review from the basic communications model. We're not talking about any barriers here, but we're talking about just basic communication models. There's the sender that sends a message, that encodes a message through a certain channel or medium. It could be written, it could be audiovisual, it could be just audio, it could be just visual. And then the receiver or the consumer receives that message, decodes it, and then provides feedback. So in this instance, with feedback and advertising, the feedback is basically whether or not you buy the product. Okay, so there's different types of communication. There's impersonal versus interpersonal, and then there's formal versus informal. So impersonal communications and messages that you send out through formal channels, through your marketing department, through your through a spokesperson, something like that. And then interpersonal communication could be either formal, like with the salesperson, or informal through your peers, meaning that the formal would be that the marketer has some level of control over what the message is, whereas informal with peers, peer-to-peer, person-to-person, you don't necessarily have as much control over it. So what is most important in all communication, we talk about communication in Marketing 1, we also talk about in organizational behavior, this idea of credibility. How credible is your source? And people tend to, there's lots of different reasons that people find a source credible, but it's important that you maintain some level of credibility. It's also credibility. I think of it as also an issue of trust, and once that trust is broken, it's really hard to gain back. If a company promises something, promises some sort of guarantee or long-lasting quality or whatever, and if they don't deliver, then you won't necessarily find it to be a credible source anymore. Okay, so there are all sorts of barriers. I mentioned that on the other slide about barriers to communication, and we'll go through and talk about them. There's a selective exposure, that this idea that you might consumers have some level of selectivity in paying attention to advertising messages. So there's also this idea, a new idea on the horizon these days called time shift. Time shift is this idea that people record things or they skip through the commercials, that kind of thing. Okay, psychological noise is also referred to as white noise. It's this idea of competing advertisement messages or distracting thoughts that you might have that affect the reception of a message. It could be, it doesn't necessarily, it might be competing advertisement, or it might just be other things going on. You're driving down the road and you see a billboard, and you're driving, so you're focusing on your driving, or maybe you're in a conversation with someone who's in the car with you, that kind of thing. Okay, and so there's all different ways that you can overcome psychological noise. One is repetition, repeating an ad, making sure it's visible in a variety of different places. This idea of contrast is also this idea of like featuring some sort of unexpected outcome or increasing the amount of sensory input. So maybe if it's a demonstration, in a grocery store, you can also smell the food. That might help you. Or you might offer people an opportunity to try the product. Okay, digital technologies allow marketers to monitor consumers' visits to the website, and from that they can extrapolate data in terms of understanding what your interests are, and then send some sort of customized promotional message to you. And then this idea of effective positioning and providing value. It's really the most effective way to ensure that a promotional message stands out and it's received and decoded properly So effective positioning, we've talked about in marketing 1, we talked about a little bit in marketing 2. You need to have a clear, consistent message in the mind of the consumer so that they know what you're looking for. The other term that we talk about, psychological noise, the other term we use to refer to it is clutter, how to break through the clutter. And one method that people often use is product placement, and movie product placement in movies or with celebrities and that kind of thing. But all these other methods work as well. That's just one that you see quite often. Okay, so let's just do a little comparison between traditional media and new media. Traditional media, generally speaking, is broadcast media in terms of television and radio. It's one-way communication, so you're not getting any feedback and any direct feedback. It's usually directed at large groups of people. It's not customized. It's not interactive. And the feedback, if it comes, it may not be accurate. It might not be as accurate as it could be, and it's usually delayed. So the new media is this idea of narrowcasting, that you can focus more traditionally, that you can send messages to people that are customized or somewhat interactive, that kind of thing. It's more two-way communication, and then you can measure the responses. That's the idea of narrowcasting. Okay, a message is some kind of thought, idea, attitude, image, or other information that the sender wishes to convey to the intended audience. Now, we all participate in communication every day. I'm participating in communication right now. I'm communicating with you guys. It's and it's one way because this is a type of broadcast. I can get feedback from you if you send me an email or a message, or call me, but it's delayed. So just to give you, that's would be another example of this one-way communication. But given the format that we're in, that's the only way we can do it right now. Okay, so messages can be sent in a variety of different ways. They can be considered. You can be verbal or nonverbal or both. Verbal communication obviously is actually speaking to you. So what you want to do in order to make sure that you have a good message is to make sure you have some sort of objective that you want to create, want to achieve. It could be awareness, it could be sales, reducing discord or dissonance that people have, create some sort of goodwill. And then what you want to do is select an appropriate medium and then design the message. So a medium, again, we talk about this in Marketing 1, that the medium should be accurate with the product. So if it's something that requires a lot of information, you're probably going to take out a print ad or do something online that people can read about it. If it's something that needs to be a quick turnaround, you might do radio, that kind of thing. So you want to make sure you have the message and the medium are equally important. Okay, so there are some message decisions. How are you going to do it? Images and text, or this idea of message framing. We're going to go through them. We're going to go through these one by one. One-sided versus two-sided, and then the order of presentation. Okay, so images and text. That they depict some sort of image. Generally speaking, it's better to use an image than it is just to use text only. There is the old saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words, which is very true in advertising. So people tend to remember that better. Okay, then there's this idea of message framing. So you can either send a positive message or a negative message. So should they press the benefits? Do they stress the benefits of the product, or the benefits lost by not using the product? So the negative message. So that would be, a lot of times we'll talk about this a little bit more, but the idea of instilling fear. So you see these ads on television for people who don't have adequate car insurance, or people who don't put that security system in, that kind of thing. How are you going to frame the message? How are you going to make people feel when they see it? All right, then there's one-sided versus two-sided messages. One-sided versus two-sided. One-sided just shows the product itself. They pretend it's the only one. Two-sided does a compare-contrast. So here you see, looking at butter versus I can't believe it's not butter, which is a product that it says, oh, it's so much healthier for you, and that kind of thing. So you're going to do it's kind of like a compare contrast, or what is it going to be like if you don't use the product? It's and in the two-sided, they do acknowledge that there's competing products. Okay, so then there's this whole idea of order effects. The people say that the material presented first produces a greater effect. Recency says that the material presented last is more effective. So, for example, the front versus the back of a magazine, or the beginning of the end of ad copy, or the beginning and the end of the message. So, what does order make a difference? So, do you want to say, if you're talking about public relations, do you want to put in a shareholders meeting, do you want to put the positive information up front so people are feeling really good about it, and maybe when they hear the bad stuff at the end, it's not as bothersome? Or do you want to, maybe tell them the bad things, all the bad things that have happened with the company over the past year, and then at the end, but say that all these things happened, but we're going to leave you with this great message and tell you how great everything has been. It's the idea of order effects. Okay, persuasive advertising appeals are often comparative. They're comparative ads. They do have some level of sophistication to them, in terms of, because they're usually a little bit more detailed. So the message is a little bit more sophisticated, generally because the person who is watching them is usually a more sophisticated consumer. There is a question as to how effective using negativity is. Sometimes it can be very, very helpful. Sometimes, as long as there's the negativity about the other product is true, then it's effective. If you're just kind of making stuff up about the other product just to make them look bad and you look better, then that could kind of fall flat. You could fall flat with that. There's also issues with gender. Generally, men and women respond to things differently. And in different situations as well. That usually comparative ads generated greater levels of brand evaluation involvement among men, but not among women. Among women, attention-getting comparative appeals produced inferences regarding the ad's manipulative intentions and reduced the purchase likelihood. So, there is a difference as how people perceive things. So if it's depending upon who's buying the product, you might want to think about that in terms of doing a comparative ad. And also, are you promoting the product, or you're trying to prevent something from happening again? And you want to make sure that you have reasonable and factual evidence to share with people. Again, that kind of goes back to this whole idea of credibility and believability. Okay, so some persuasive advertising appeals or fear appeals could be considered, distracted driving, getting home safely. It could also be things like, as I mentioned before, this whole idea about having the, home safety and that kind of thing. And again, that also goes back to, we talked about in a previous chapter about Maslow's need hierarchy, which again, we talk about in Marketing 1. We also talk about it in organizational behavior, and you also talk about it in management, this idea that people respond differently to the idea of a fear appeal. There are some guidelines that you should follow if you're going to go with the fear appeal way. You need to understand the pre-appeal's reactions in previous experiences. Sometimes the boomerang effect, it can come back and hit you in the face. Sometimes behavior change could take a long time. And you also want to make sure that you're not causing too much anxiety for people, because that could be a problem. You also wanted to see whether it's a rational or emotional fear appeal. So when we're talking about power of persuasion, rational looks at this idea of, well, if you don't do this, it's going to cost you X amount of dollars, or it's going to take X amount more time to take care of. Whereas emotional more plays on, your feelings of safety and security, that kind of thing. And also, again, we talk about repeat advertising. It's important to do that. And now this idea of some addicts may not respond, so the smoking cessation ads or drinking cessation ads, that kind of thing. It might be difficult for them for a variety of reasons. They might not respond. just because it's even though there are already warnings for them, addiction is a whole separate issue. And also, you should also kind of always remember are alternatives to fear appeals. So reward-focused appeals or even portraying humor and happiness when trying to discourage certain conduct may sometimes work better than using fear. Which brings us to humorous appeals. Many marketers use humorous appeals in the belief that humor will increase the acceptance and persuasiveness of their advertising. People respond to humor. People like humor. It's the most widely used of all advertising appeals, and some say it's 80% of all ads. So it enhances the likability of the product. It doesn't necessarily change whether or not people will remember the ad. In fact, in some cases, it actually helps people remember the ad more. Doesn't always necessarily increase the ad's persuasive impact or a source's credibility, but that doesn't mean you necessarily shouldn't use it. If it's relevant to the product, there's some products that are just not funny products, but there's some products that lend themselves to being funnier than others. You think about car insurance ads, for example, that on one hand, being in an accident is not necessarily a funny thing, but you can't add humor to it. Smoking cessation ads, for example, or ads about, cancer care or any kind of medical care, there's really no humor in there, so you don't necessarily want to use that. Generally speaking, it's better for low involvement products that people buy on a regular basis. And, it changes from person to person, but it is an option. So, and then they also use this idea of wordplay. It's kind of, this idea of having humorous, or things that are humorous or have a double meaning to them. Okay, so in addition to fear and humor, there's also the whole old adage that sex sells. They rarely, though, encourage any kind of actual consumption. People just generally remember it more. Receptivity to it usually varies among people. And it's something that's definitely used. The question really remains is how effective is it? Okay, so there is this whole idea of persuasive advertising appeals and timeliness appeals. So the idea of timeliness appeals is if you want to restore some sort of confidence in a product, or if you want to make people feel good during a bad economic time, or it's this idea of time is of the essence. So you're trying to maybe encourage people to take advantage of something. The economy is bad, so eat at home and buy things at the grocery store, or do your own home repairs, that kind of thing. Okay, and then finally you want to find out, you want to get some sort of feedback. So that's important with the impersonal communications we talked about, or in mass media you don't necessarily get feedback, but interpersonal communications you get immediate feedback. And there are different ways to determine that. You can see, how effective are the sales, how are the sales affected differently with persuasion effects, in terms of persuasion as opposed to media exposure, the more media exposure, that kind of thing. So you want to, and there's ways to, we talk about media exposure, we talk about Nielsen ratings. They buy data from firms that monitor media audiences, that kind of thing. Okay, so that's a real quick look at persuading consumers. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you back for Chapter 8.